Rebecca graduated with me at Camberwell 2 years ago. Currently doing residency at Children Hell, kind of like a young, emerging thing. So good at describing things. Yeah. Wow. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. So when I was thinking about how to best start this talk, I think it's best to start with where I was working since I graduated 2 years ago. A few places, but one of them was a office fitters. They would install and design furniture for office environments. And it took the form, these aren't examples of what they made, but they would design booths for specific styles of conversation that you'd have in the workplace, for specific situations. For example, there was a particular booth they designed for talk, which was specifically made for two people to go into a small room and talk one-to-one, and it was completely raw, sound barrier, really most similar to the lower image. They also designed larger spaces where about 4 or 5 people would have the opportunity to talk to each other on an intimate level. They also made another one called Chat, which was specifically for when 2 people wanted kind of less formal conversation that wasn't sound barriered. And all these different booths and units which were to be situated in kind of an open plan office space for very specific reasons. And I was working with this company as just the administrator, so I had kind of an outward observational perspective on this. I wasn't really involved in it at the time. But I suppose I found these environments and booths and units very coercive. They weren't necessarily reactive to how people naturally interact with each other, interact with space, and it was all very much if you need to do this, you will go to this space. If you want a phone call on your own in a private space, you go to this space. And if you want, they made variations on the same kind of booth, one which had 4 seats facing each other, another which had 6 seats facing each other, another with 8 seats, and they were all designed separately. They all had, it was kind of like hub 3, hub 5, hub 7. So you had this kind of choice of these spaces which you have to kind of select from when you're working in this kind of office environment. I was working for, we were all doing, you could be using eBay. And it's this coercive nature of design, particularly office furniture design and also retail and environmental layout, that I think having that external perspective really I say so much bothered me, as I thought it was kind of a failure on the part of the designers to take into account, and maybe it's more pervasive for that design kind of industry, but to take into account how people really naturally interact with each other. We don't need these specific spaces for doing specific, very, very specific things. It should be more natural engagement. Just before, this is a lovely photo of where I worked for about 4 years. I was a retail assistant, very glamorous, and then a retail manager. And I had been working there for so long. I observed similar things with the kind of retail apparatus, how you're drawn to certain stands, how retail signage and spatial layout and product placement is all kind of coercive design, so you move throughout space in a very specific way. And as I was working for a very long time, and I had access to the warehouse, and my studio's upstairs. So this is in Camberwell, this space, and it's a fairly large warehouse building. And upstairs, in the top story, there's lots of artists' studios. And so after work, I think it's it's quite important to me, the kind of the idea that my pretty much my entire life existence for a prolonged period of time since leaving, and also kind of before leaving, is university, is divided between workspace, place that I'm there every day for a prolonged period of time, and getting paid for it, and work in the studio, which I have to pay for, and where I get to make my own work. So it's kind of divided between the two, and it was made even more evident that my studio was upstairs, my workplace was downstairs. So I'd kind of, the relationship between the two is even, between this dividing of time and kind of dividing of labour was even more evident in that kind of respect. So I'd take things from the warehouse, old retail fixtures and fittings, and take them upstairs and kind of into a massive collection of stands and slat wall, particularly slat wall, which is what I describe as like the basic building block of any retail shop. You would have seen it. It's the kind of wall-mounted panels with strips across it, with many like interchangeable hooks and accessories to hang specific things. But you will find it in shops selling vegetables, fruit, clothing, like anything. It's the kind of the most basic building block of a retail environment. I'll take these upstairs and make a bit of a collection out of them and see how these objects would kind of work when they were taken out of these environments in part, but also it started to get very kind of the two interests of retail, along with my experience with the design industries and how they create these places which are not natural, which are not, when they're brought into kind of a physical conclusion, don't actually make a lot of sense, or a lot of sense to how we relate to objects. These are some examples of images that I use as kind of early reference points for artwork. They are visual representations of how slat wall and how certain retail objects should be used or displayed, or kind of the options of layout. And I found that a lot of these objects on 3D renders in particular we used as examples of like how to use these things, and bringing them to their physical conclusion made them kind of accentuated the absurdity of how these things were, these kind of renders and design eccentricities kind of. So this was actually got 2 or 3 slides from a show that we did at Rogue Studios, which indeed lost January. And yeah, as I said, I've amassed this kind of selection of visual imagery from 3D renders and kind of digitally manipulated images of retail spaces, and also kind of a physical collection of objects themselves. And I started to remake these objects with a similar kind of coldness of design and basically a mimicry of how of those kind of images I showed you earlier. This was a stand. It was the stand was inspired by an image that I found on the internet, but also while I worked in this retail shop, I had a lot of stands which were very similar. And the objects were chosen fairly arbitrarily. It was a decision which I saw mimicked the similar decisions that were made when these 3D designs were These are 2 panel pieces that I made. The objects, I thought it was quite interesting how in these renders the kind of the objects placed in certain places denoted how these hanging, these kind of accessories should be used. And I wanted to, I don't know if I necessarily want to undermine that, just experiment with the idea of showing them how, in kind of a different way. So, kind of slightly moving on from that ever so slightly, when I taking the materials away, I was playing with a lot of the stuff in my studio. I found that taking the materials away from firstly the slat walls, two smaller slat walls, kind of exposed the kind of dumbness of these accessories and how they, without the materials on them, without the kind of use, their kind of function being very self-evident, they became kind of, dumb objects. They were asking for something to be placed on them, but they didn't, but that wasn't kind of happening, and they projected out in kind of like a, I don't know, I find them quite bodily. They're kind of almost like pseudo kind of sexual objects. They have these extensions and these gullies where and they're quite intrusive, but also the surface of them. When I initially had things up in my studio, I was having these pieces of slat wall and painting onto them. It felt more like I was defacing them, like I was taking these objects and I wasn't really owning them. It seemed very separate from me. It was like, they started as almost like found objects, and then they became objects that I made marks on. And there was a movement towards it. I wanted to have these objects as mine, as being mine, so I started pouring them with Jesmonite. There, with the small ones. I started pouring them with Jesmonite and inflicting my own kind of mark making on them. It was a mimicry of the kind of pattern that built up from these bits that I'd collected, which had thousands of hands over them all the time. All the time I'd taken them, and I wanted to make them mine. So this was kind of a kind of progression towards that. Similarly, going back to this image here, I started working with. Started thinking of the idea of these objects being put back into a space and using various objects that I'd collected and seeing how creating a kind of pseudo-retail environment might similarly affect the way people interact with them. They're almost like performers in a stage, so they've got their own. You kind of draw. They instinctively you recognise them as retail paraphernalia, bits of parts of retail, bits of kind of stands and the apparatus of retail. But how when you interact with them on a kind of like art level, or maybe I don't know, kind of seeing how they perform in that respect, how they kind of interact with the viewer in that regard. I also play around with a lot of 3D imaging in my work. It's even more as sketches and kind of repetitions of the same kind of things, using the imagery of retail images, but then making it kind of almost impossible or not, definitely not possible to bring into some kind of physical imaging. So that's another example of that, which is also a sketch. More recently, as an extension of this idea of ownership, I've been using Jesmonite to make these slat wall pieces, and they have, as I was saying earlier, the act of ownership and imbuing these things with some kind of like the mess from my studio or things I have around my studio. And for example, this one's got processing kind of embedded into the surface. And picking out the surface and disrupting the kind of flatness of it is an ownership aspect of these things. A lot of the images I'll be showing you have these slat wall panels and have accessories on them, as you can see, these are like 3 hooks. But this is always open to change. Whenever I show my work, I'll normally take a selection of hooks and things, and then it will be kind of an on-the-moment decision. For me, this kind of fluidity is really important. I get quite bored of artworks when they are done. When they're finished, I find them a lot more disposable when they feel completed. So it's kind of consistent, constant ability to kind of circulate ideas. This comes through, yes, kind of this wanting to change everything, but also the same kind of thing happens with, I'll make lots of repetitions of the same object as an aspect of choice. And whether this, I think partly this comes from when I was working in that digital design, a good place for digital office furniture. They make various kind of options which had very little difference between them. So one of the booths, the difference between the 2 of them will be the one will have a whiteboard in it, or there'll be an extra piece of seating, or there'll be an extra bookshelf, and each of these things kind of were sold as different things, which kind of illusions of choice in a sense. So you could choose this one, you could choose this one, and you know, but fundamentally they're all the same. So a lot of my work that's how I'll make the same thing again and again, and either the choice will be the change of arrangement within. So well, this one has kind of been, this example has kind of been been put to the side. I've started making larger panel pieces. Similarly, this definitely still doesn't look the same as it does there. It's got completely different attachments. I've made a kind of twin to it, which is a larger version of the black partnership. This is an example of kind of the more recent work, taking the kind of recognisable form of a hanging retail sign and having lots of options for it, which are all equally as non-directional. As I was saying earlier, when I was really irritated, what bothered me about design was that it was very directional and dictatorial. You had to go to these places to do this kind of thing, and there wasn't much choice to do things in kind of a different way. So I guess these works are in part a lot of my work is playing that. Actually, I need to go back in a second because I didn't describe something, but I'm interested in making kind of like a doppelganger retail environment where none of the signs point to anything and none of the retail systems actually work, and you walk into the space and they'll be immediately recognisable as the original objects that I've kind of taken inspiration from, and in that you're looking for some kind of point of where you want to go, or they are visibly still their kind of signage, but they have no directional input. When I actually, in fact, I don't have an example of this, so I don't take many photos of my work, but I've started making my own inserts and accessories for this flat wall system. In a way, because I felt that even though these accessories kind of, with other objects, they're kind of dumb objects, they're still wanting to have things, they're still telling you that there is something that needs to go on there. There is a definite function still to them, even if it isn't being kind of confirmed or like made into reality. And so unfortunately I don't have any photos, but I've been making these metal attachments which can't be hung, the objects can't be hung onto, they're kind of bent out of shape so you can't use them, so they're kind of completely devoid of their function. And yeah, so trying to get my ideal situation would have a room, an exhibition, which is a complete selection of these objects as doppelganger objects, where you encounter them and you feel instinctively like you kind of know what to do with them, but there's no objects, there's no functional end to how they are, and I suppose kind of re-establishing the relationship between how you, where you expect there to be a function that is unfunctional anymore, and seeing how it always relates to that. But yeah, I think more or less this is where my practice is at the moment, working with these larger panel pieces, and in connection with these digital 3D models. And yeah, I think that kind of concludes my talk. I don't know how long I've been talking for, but yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so for me it was interesting when Dean asked me to take part in this talk with Rebecca. And I immediately was thinking to myself, okay, what do I want to talk about here? And I felt I don't want to, I didn't want to talk about the work as a product and this is what I've done and this is what I'm doing, because actually that doesn't really take the same role with me. So I thought what I want to do is just open up the process here and kind of talk about it in that way of my position and kind of discussing that and opening that up as a question really. And I want to start by saying that none of these points are definite. I mean, Rebecca and I worked together before we did a performance, and the key point of the performance was talking about the kind of fluid situation that we all stand in, where these relations or these positions that we have, they're always fluid, they're always in motion. So what I want to do is talk about my process as it's been with the work and how it's manifested the work, without at the same time sort of saying that that's a definite point. And I really want to also, as we come towards the end of the talk, kind of ask for people's feedback and opinions in terms of the questions that I'll kind of outline as I go through this. So to begin with, I want to start with what I normally do when I'm going for a project, is I start with a question. And I go to particular sites. This is a photograph that I took in Westfield Shopping Centre in East London, West London. And this was a wall that you're greeted with. As soon as you come into the centre, there's this huge, massive billboard. And what I do is, when I kind of have this question, the question I had with this place is, how do places appear to you when you enter them? And what kind of condition are they actually under? And so I was looking at this place, I took this picture, and I immediately started sensing there was kind of something up here. This is where I kind of come from, I think. There's a feeling that I've got going on. It's not a head thing, it's really just a quality that's affected onto me that I respond to. That's how my work develops. It's not about thinking it through. The thinking kind of comes through the feeling, if that makes sense, in terms of the process for me and how I feel about it. So I was presented with this image and I thought, well, there's something happening here. There's this natural projection of nature which is rendered onto this billboard, and underneath it they fabricated this natural form. And what's happening here is you have this artificial presentation naturalized through these plants which they've planted underneath. And this image led to the first piece of work I did, a major piece of work as part of this project. So what's happening here is, through quite a consistent sort of exploration, I created this work which is about 5 meters long. And what you've got is the image that you saw before. I took that foliage and I turned it into a fossil just through using some digital tools. Because I was thinking, what you've got going on in this image is nature becomes this support mechanism to try and naturalize this incredibly artificial presentation that is being shown to you. And so what's happening in this site is nature acts like a fossil to support this new type of represented material. Now my work, again, I don't want to kind of limit it within these kind of parameters, but my work essentially for me at the moment is looking at how we produce spaces, under what intentions they're produced, how we write scripts within them, and how those scripts are then affected onto you as essentially a user of that site. Now you're talking about a shopping centre here, so obviously the script that's been written into the centre, into the surface of these centres, is being affected onto you for you to perform a particular action, which is generally to consume and to buy. Now, this represented material that you can see here are these paintings which I hung off this billboard. Painting in a way, this is actually when I was starting, I was looking at how you can kind of render effects in some kind of way. So it's for me just kind of going back to a process. I encounter places, I take pictures, I figure out what's happening in these pictures, and then the work begins to kind of develop out of that. This is just some detailed kind of shot so you can see they're hammered into the billboard with these masonry nails. So thinking about the canvas that I've painted now as an object, and how you're playing with the kind of the role of the image, its illusion, its presentation, how things appear to be, and what they actually are. So it's kind of playing with a bit of trompe-l'oeil. People, when they saw it from afar, they thought it was flat. I mean, I don't know if anyone kind of gets that really, but that was really interesting to me, that people kind of had these kind of initial assumptions. And what I want to kind of also, I mean, Dean and I worked together the first time when I came up to do a collaborative project with him, with another artist called Mikey Cook. And as part of that project, I showed, it ended up taking the form of an installation. As part of the project, I showed this video piece. When I was working through the project with Dean, my key question that really corresponded to Mikey, who I was collaborating with, is how do we produce these sites of leisure? How do we produce these sites where you go into as a user and you feel accommodated, you feel pleasured? How do you navigate these places? Now, I went to Tottenham in London, and I went around and I started taking these pictures, and this was a video I took. I was standing on a canal bridge in Tottenham, and I saw this ball that some guy or some girl had obviously kicked off the bridge and it had fallen into the canal. And this ball was just stuck there. And it was just self-perpetuating in this motion. You know, it looked to me as I encountered it in that moment that it had been there for however long. It seemed like it had been there forever. And I filmed this piece, and this piece, it was just a moment, a brief moment, and this played a real key role as me and Mikey developed the show, because when we're looking at these leisure sites that we produced, I'm thinking here about this kind of self-perpetuating, you're a dog as a user chasing your own tail. There's a certain level of banality which I think pervades these sites and actually affects into our lives. What role do we play, what intention? It's just this immediate gratification. There's no where that we seem to be moving going forward. Is there like a collective consensus? There is some idea of progress which is quantified in terms of what you possess or what you have, and we all think that we're going forward in this kind of great way, but where does that actually kind of touch in our own human selves of where we want to actually be? I mean, I'm not going to kind of go on to that, as a bit of a distraction, but so those kind of questions started posing out, and I'll tap into this project here now. So the project with me and Mikey that ended up taking shape in Dean's space, for me, I titled it at the beginning as a question, as a project, Let's Go Swimming. You know, let's go swimming, let's go enjoy ourselves, let's go to the pool, whatever it might be. There's just a couple of things here. I mean, just a quote, sometimes I might bring some quotes in just in terms of my own research, and there's one from Wilson. He says, "The state turns nature into something to be appreciated by the eyes alone." Again, it's like you encounter these places or people, and they are all cultivated now where you will consume them as images. You think about the relations you have to people or to spaces, you will consume them as an image. That is what kind of nature is being developed as part of a social condition that we have today. Well, these are my thoughts on it anyway. So the project that I'm going to skip straight to it. So this is the form the project took. Mikey's work is the carved sculptural piece here, and then my work here, which was is hanging piece on the wall. Maybe it'd be better if I just started taking you through that one. So these pieces developed when I did this residency out in Italy, and it was just after I graduated. I'd actually just been in Berlin, and all of a sudden I was put in this monastery in Chile for 2 months by myself. And going back to my process, what I do is I really just respond to that situation I'm in, as you saw with the image from Westfields in London and how that developed. And I started looking at this area around me in Italy, and I was thinking, my gosh, it just seems like everything here is being cultivated to be effectively a suite in the tourist travel shop. That's the major industry around me, is tourism. And the culture, the landscape, the people, everything that I seem to encounter seem to have been adapted to be, I call it for this project, a suite in the tourist travel shop. So then I found this book of postcard images of the Piedmont Mountains, and I took these images, and when I was back in London, this is like months after, I didn't actually make this work on the residency, I started scanning these postcard images in and put all this dirt all over them. So I was thinking, you know, what is the condition of these places today? And it was like, they're like a sort of dirty Kodak memory. And if I bring that sweet thing up again, it's like these places, it's this dirty kind of memory that we have, are then presented on this kitsch, sweet structure, which is the tourist catalogue, the way that you consume them in that kind of a way. And then these works fed directly into 24K Gold Rita, which is the project that we did with Dean. There's a poem also that we worked with someone on to have as part of the project. This was kind of looking at how, you know, with any kind of work or show I make, I do think about the narrative in such a way. I don't want to script the narrative to be specific and say, you must read this particular kind of story. It's more about me giving a kind of a framework in a way for you to respond to in your way. I won't read that because it'll take a while.
It's on the website.
It's on the website. And so the show, what you have here is you have trailage, which is used, a domestic use in gardens, and it's about how you can, well, what we were looking at the show is how you can produce these sites of leisure, under what intent do we use things like bin stickers, where people buy these bin stickers, put them into their bins, and it's like this idea of exoticism and escapism. So you have the exoticizing of your domestic situation, which, I mean, I talk for myself, there's a banality in it, you know, my house or whatever, it's a bit of a shithole, so, you know, but that's what I have in London, and that's the best I can have with it. And then, you know, Mikey was talking about how he's encountered people or places where you see this street, you know, of these houses, and they've got these bin stickers outside, they've got this like plaster cast of Michelangelo's David or whatever just in there, and it's like they're kind of exoticizing this fantasy parameter around themselves, and it is a form of escapism. And so this really kind of channeled in quite keenly with both of us. And then what we ended up deciding to do is put this sand down on the floor, paint this trailage on the wall. Mikey's sculptures incepted the sand, my panel of wall-based pieces incepted the wall. And it was, you know, the sand as people moved, we sprayed the sand with Indian ink, so as people kind of moved through it, there was traces of their navigation. We didn't know where people would walk as they entered the show. And as the show went on, these particular paths became quite apparent because the sand was kicked up, and then habitually people would follow the paths and footprints of those who went before them. So we then get into a whole other question of how, in a way of conditioning, do we then also follow the others? So when you enter into any place, you might follow the direction of another person. So how is your position, how is your intent affected not only by the space, but also the people with which you encounter that space with? So yeah, then this kind of leads, again, kind of thinking about process. So with the project I did for Catlin, I spent a lot of time researching these new CGI renders of property developments around the world. This is an example of one in Singapore. And so I spent quite a lot of time, but it was really fun actually, just kind of looking at these new developments here, there, and everywhere, seeing what I would effectively kind of describe as a lifestyle concept in these renders which they created. And you look at these lifestyle concepts, and you know, basically what you're supposed to do as a user is buy into that concept. You see yourself in that image, that is what you relate to, that becomes you, and you buy into that place. And so, you know, through some quite fun experimentation, I began to crop into these places and sort of frame these moments within these scenes that had been rendered. And these moments that these fed into the panel pieces. So you see another kind of crop here, another one here. So this is actually in London. Again, this one's in London. And I just want to again thinking about the process. So when I was developing the project, I was using some 3D rendering software to compose the installation that I was going to present as part of the show. And I don't normally work in this very quite scripted way. But I wanted to work like this for this project because the subject I was working with, the tools that I used to work through the project were the tools that these designers, these belief manufacturers use when they're creating these images. So the tools that I use, really, I try to make them resonate with whatever the content is or whatever the subject is. The names, as you can, so I used Sharfwall as part of what you see as we go on. But the little titles you've got here, which are the numbers in pink, so these numbers are the GPS coordinates of each of those panel pieces. So these images I just showed you, that place where it's intended to be situated, if you typed in one of these GPS coordinates, it would take you to the location of that development site. Now, if you went to one of these development sites now, there would really be nothing there. There would very likely just be a load of brown earth and some whatever it might be. Because you're thinking here about how these places appear and what they actually are. And this question comes to light, especially within this project. And you can see the gold flag, I mean, we'll go to the actual, how it ended up being. So this was the final outcome of that. So I used Sharfwall. So the metal frames that you see, they're Sharfwall. So these are one of the most basic kind of components they use in these new prefab buildings. It's cheap. It's the most cheap and efficient way you can actually create a space. And so they fill them up with little boards and stuff like that. And then they say, this is your swanky new flat for ridiculous rip-off price. I put the gold, so here you go, there's a gold flag here stuck into a rock with a piece of bird shell in. Again, this thinking about this kind of the production of leisure, how you use these spaces, what their purpose is, how your behaviour becomes a performance as part of that lifestyle concept that you have entered into. One of the key things I will say about the panels that you can kind of see here is I developed a print technique for the images where if you went behind the panel and looked through, it would disappear. The image would completely disappear. So these images, or these places, only appeared when you saw them from the front. When you went back into the corner of that place and looked back out, the images in the panels would completely disappear. And that was, again, really trying to kind of raise the question to the user or the viewer or the audience, whatever word you want to use for them, is how things can appear to you and what they actually are. Because I think as we encounter things, as I said earlier, when everything is cultivated to exist as an image, and you really have to kind of persevere with actually, I don't want to say it's like a truth finding, but actually what is this thing? What is really going on here? Which is, I guess, essentially kind of like what my process is in trying to sort of figure that one out. So what's back there? I mean, I can sort of mention this really briefly, just in terms of research that was being done on it, but you can really see just an example of how lifestyle can be so scripted and rendered for your consumption, your pleasure. You know, you feel you're buying into this great idyllic kind of space or place for you or your family, whatever it might be, but you know, it's all about you, but the needs that are being looked at here are very self-referential. All these sites, they fulfill their own needs. They refer back to themselves consistently. It's a self-referring kind of model, and it's just as you know, you've got to laugh in some ways. This, again, kind of video, I'm actually not going to show that one. The last thing I'm going to actually end on this one though, just as a kind of talking about the position of things here. This was a piece that was part of that project which developed from these images I took in Westfield. So, again, as I kind of focus on how I'm asking you a question, the images you see in the cube, I filmed at the hotel screen in Munich. And as soon as I entered this hotel, I was greeted with this massive flat-inch plasma TV, and it had all of these idyllic natural scenes presented of me. And so again, we're thinking about how people write a script within a space. Obviously, they were intending I would enter into this hotel and feel relaxed, it was a natural environment, a home, whatever the kind of feelings their marketing team thought were best applicable in that way. And the question that I kind of asked then is, as I've recorded these and then reformed them now onto this object, you can see the distortion of the screen that I filmed them on. So the kind of question is like, these are so far removed from what they once were, so what are they now? I mean, that's not a cube, obviously, it's a video, but you know, where are these places? You know, how are you accessing that now, and what effectively are they? And that question again is, I think, is a question that really kind of ties in between all of the work. Really, is like, you know, how does that thing appear to be, and what is it actually? Obviously, the subject depends on whichever project it is, but that really is kind of where I feel I really take it down to in essence is, how does it appear to be to you? What judgment do you make upon it? And what condition is it actually in? Yeah, so that's basically an intro on that one. So I thought between me and you we could, for me, I was thinking of talking about collaboration, this kind of process on that, because you know, when I was working with Mikey, obviously as we've worked together before, you know, collaboration has always been, to me, it's like everybody in this world will know something you don't know. And when I've worked with Rebecca, the performance we developed, you know, I learned a lot from that, just in these, you know, quite private, intimate chats that we had. And as practitioners in the position that we're in, you know, we recently graduated just about a year ago now. So it's a lot about kind of like figuring out where we're at in response to the work. You know, this is for me the point of the talk is not to kind of say this is me and this is what I do, but it's actually really thinking about where I'm coming from, where you're coming from as well. And that isn't something that's fixed, and I don't want anyone here to kind of think that I'm going to tell you exactly where I'm at, and then for you to also leave this talk and think that you should know exactly where you're at, because that should always be such a kind of permeable, fluid thing. So maybe we can kind of open it up on that topic of collaboration, and how that's played in the practice as well.
Yeah, I mean, the only collaboration I've really done properly, truly collaborative is within that performance. I think you had a much more collaborative relationship with Michael when you did your show. And that was just down to kind of natural kind of factors when the pieces that I showed in my presentation were part of the show with Rebecca Ackroyd Gabriel Birch. Rebecca graduated from the RA this year, just gone, 2 years ago. This year? One of the years. one of the recent years. And Gabriel from the RCA. It's new recently, but I don't know, it's due to factors that it was less of a collaborative project and slightly more individual than I think. We didn't have so much relation between our work. Like active relationship between our work as you and Mikey did, so we didn't infringe on each other's space, which I find kind of an interesting way of working. I kind of aspire, I think when I look to make my own work, I look to almost for it to infringe on its own space, for each work to be of work. I don't quite know where I draw the line between individual work and kind of like an installation based kind of project end up.
I thought it was quite interesting when you were taking everyone through your work, and you were talking about initially how these particular spaces had been produced and their use was intended where a user would enter in and it was a social space. It was like maybe a meeting space. But then obviously me and you both look at the methods in which these spaces are fabricated, the kind of surfaces. I mean, as Rebecca was talking about the panels and such, these are predominantly present in retail spaces. They have their surface, they have their image, they present these products on top. And it's kind of like thinking, I think, between us, something that really ties us together is how these spaces are fabricated and how these surfaces present a particular feeling. You know?
Yeah, I think it's also the kind of the act of the designers. I mean, maybe it's kind of because I've had like particular kind of experience with working on beside these people that actually design them. I think I was in a talk, but when these people were designing these office furniture booths, it kind of became evident they didn't actually, not only did they not know what they were doing, they weren't furniture designers, they weren't layout designers, they weren't in any way kind of, I don't know, kind of experienced enough to do this with any true reflection of how people actually interact with each other. They were recently graduated product designers, which is an entirely different thing from, you know, in that you don't necessarily understand how people like socially interact in that kind of study space. But I think we're both interested in how design inflicts on us its own idea of what we are. So we are kind of preordained to act these situations, whether it be like, you know, having like a beautifully like flat plaza with flats surrounding it, or whether it's going to a workplace that kind of habitually every day and feeling like you should interact with certain booths, certain units in very specific ways. Well, I mean, one of the interesting things about this is when they were designing these things for this, for not just eBay, it was for like, they were meant to be rolled out across any kind of company that wanted them, basically, but we were doing it specifically as kind of a trial run for eBay. One of the interesting things was I mean, I guess the point where the idea of their intended use is so divorced from how you would naturally interact with these spaces that they were thinking about putting beacons into the units which would send a Bluetooth message to your phone, or like it would interact with your phone so like letter, and it would tell you what this unit was meant to be used for. So yeah, it's just like, right, here is where you have your private phone call, here is where two people talk to each other, and you have a brief talk, because the stores aren't made very comfortable, so this is where you go when you just have an idea, and you walk into this booth which is completely soundproof, and you just kind of perch and have your little chat. And this is where you have your group meeting 4 people when you want to crash out ideas, when you have one for 6 people, and it kind of gets like increasingly more absurd as these things kind of go, and people are kind of making up their own ideas in their own heads about how people react. I don't know, I think for anyone that's like an artist having a studio or has been to art school, I think that when there aren't those structures in place, when you just have space, these spaces naturally create themselves. You naturally have your kind of situations where you just kind of sit and chat and ideas are shared naturally, and maybe that's more of a problem with how people work today and the over professionalisation of how people interact with each other.
Do you not think that could be about the way people are taught?
Taught as in like educational? Do you mean specifically in like art, with art?
Yeah, like specific fields. I don't know, but it's just like art is such a arbitrary thing now, do you know what I mean? It could be nothing, do you know?
Art is very important. I do say something. No, I think it's I think it probably is an issue with the way people talk, but I think it's kind of like pervasive throughout a lot of society now. Everything's kind of coordinated, and the idea is that it has to be for certain like economical reasons. Everything has to be kind of over efficient.
Your question was kind of taking it into another point as well. Whatever conditioning you've been through your education, your family, whatever. I mean, I talk about mine in itself. I have made active, conscious choices to behave in the way that I do, I guess, and do what I do. And, you know, we've all gone through these systems. You know, we all have. And you get to a point, and it's about, I guess, what I do is or what we do is it's about saying this is my perception of something, and I want to share that perception. I'm not saying that perception is right or wrong, but it's just my take on it. And you can then choose to enter into that conversation or stay fixed in a position that you've been in before, because through that conditioning you may have these values instilled on you where you think that you have to use a place in such a way or act in such a way but it is your choice to do that deep down, and I think a key thing is to make people aware that they have that ability to choose who they are, how they act, and how they respond to a situation or a particular person. That is a capability we all have, which seems to be knocked out of our kind of conscious awareness, that we think that we are part of, some people think they're just part of a cog in the machine. I mean, I feel like that sometimes, it gets me in some difficult places in my mind, but I do know ultimately it's about my choice and the way that I choose to see that thing. But it's not so black and white as it's just a choice between doing that or not doing that. There's a lot of other things that kind of come between that.
I definitely think that my work is like a response to the feeling of being a cog in the machine, because I think I have worked in retail out of necessity for 7 years, worked in the same shop for 4 years throughout my MBA, and then finished, started full-time work there a year afterwards, and then my first job in this office environment was administration. They very soon realised I wasn't that good at administration. I'm not made for admin. I don't really have the kind of conviction to really care about these things, which they didn't want to do. After this, I worked in another interior design facing the same thing, so it was even easier. And so, yeah, I think for me personally, my feelings about work is kind of firstly a natural response. As I was saying, if I'm dividing my time between work and the studio, then my immediate reaction with objects is with stuff that I have around me, the stuff in the workplace, it's stuff that I have to sit and look at every single day. So it will naturally kind of come into my practice, but also making art for me is a way of I said about like ownership when I was talking about my work. It's a way of kind of an outlet. It's like taking these things, which I know aren't necessarily mine because I don't know how to digitally design anything. I don't know how to really mix that, or I'm not a layout designer or a furniture designer or any kind of designer. But taking these things, which is basically all I have from my lived experience, and trying to make them and trying to have an output which is not just the sum of my parts in retail, of having something where I feel like I have some control over the situation. For me personally, because that's where I've been for the last kind of 2 years.
Yeah, I think I'm coming back to this. Also, my process in such a way, going through a project is. I talk for myself, and I think it relates to you as well. It's almost like acting as a semi-anal. And a semi-anal is somebody who is like an adventurer, and they adventure around and they gather these signs, they gather these symbols. It's like bits of content, and then they take what they gathered and they bring it back, and they reform it under a different condition. And I think that's kind of what I do a lot. And as I was saying, when I start a project, I start with a question. And then I'll go to these places and I'll take pictures or videos or some sound stuff, and I'll start to gather these bits of content in. And then the image I showed you initially, where you had that projected, pastoral scene, and then the foliage that had been cultivated underneath it, that for me signified particular things, just in the way that I responded to it. Without overthinking it, it signified particular things. And it was that language that I was presented with that led into that kind of other work. And that's kind of, I guess, what you're talking about as well. You have your lived experience in the way that you encounter things. And then you begin to respond to those things. You gather them together and you present them under these, in new conditions, in different forms and such. And they act in different ways. And there's a particular, in my mind, there's this grey territory between these points of what it was and what it is now. And it's in that territory that the most interesting things can happen, because that's where the questions are asked, that's where the unknown is happening. Because I'm not sitting here and saying that's what the work is, that's what it's doing. I'm sitting here and talking about my response, my feelings about it, but it's really keenly also about your response, your feelings about the work that are more valid, in my opinion, than mine, because it's put out there, and without any precondition, you can react in whatever way you choose to react. And when you choose to react or read something in that way, you can then start to think about your position. And that's kind of what it's about, is shaking that up a bit.
Do you think you're the person who's conditioning?
Me?
Yeah.
In what, when I put the work
Like when you construct a piece, like it's almost as though you're programming people to change the way that they're perceiving in general. Do you know what I mean? Instead of looking at a shot,
yeah,
they're
it's
seeing
kind of
machines
like
now.
it's kind of like an instigator, if you know what I mean. But,
Okay.
but like I said, I think it's dangerous for a practitioner to start to say you should read it in this way or respond to it in that way. And it really is, for me, more interesting for someone to have a very different response to anything I might have thought about when making the work, and understand where that's coming from, because that unknown, when you're asking a question, opens up the interesting stuff, which isn't the known stuff. Because if you know it, why have you asked a question about it? It's just pointless, you know? So
It's a drama.
I think my work's kind of similar, and it's kind of like I like to do work quite like privately. I like to make things in my own space, in my own time. It's part of this kind of like having a collection of stuff and working with it and seeing how it goes. And yeah, definitely for me, similarly, I think the audience kind of, for me, maybe more so than you come second. Like I things I make because I want to, and because I feel kind of conviction to make them, and I feel like these are kind of issues that I'm dealing with ideas of design, kind of how. But maybe I'm slightly conflicted, because when it comes to the actual display of these objects, I want them to look like they are part of a retail environment that was never quite made, it's kind of doppelganger again. So when everything kind of relates, so the prints that I showed on my last slide, when all those kind of hanging signs, they would be prints which would be hung quite high, so they would keep in situ with where they're expected to be. But so the kind of the decision-making process of how people will see it is done right at the very end, right in the exhibition space. But when it comes to making, that's where, for me, I'm making very much for myself. I don't know if you feel the same way about your work. I mean, I make it comes back to this thing of kind of control, trying to have some control, trying to have some,
I mean, you kind of bring in the question then, you have two different approaches. You have the outsider artist. Now, the outsider artist is someone who makes work really just for themselves. They don't intend to, I know that, but they don't intend to kind of show it in that way. Now, on the other side is where we both are. We're aware that we're putting the work into that situation. And I'll talk from, for me, it is a bit of a balance, because you have to be aware in how people may respond to that. You use content which is very weighted, it might have other associations which distracts from the point. And so you have to find a balance between being aware of what people might read the work as, and this is completely fictionalizing it, you don't know what they're going to read it as. But you can kind of, sort of tempt that a bit. You're like, okay, well, what could they get from this? But you don't want to cater to it. It's not like you're thinking, oh, I need to change it because they might read this or that. I mean, if it works in part of the way that you're reading it, then you kind of have to follow that a bit.
Yeah, if anything, I'm trying to not cater for people, to kind of want to put, the reason I change things, or I make adaptations to things, or make things without any kind of directional signage, without any kind of directional input, with no definite, finite end, is because I want to not have that situation where people are just, kind of reading the work, as in the same way they can read that space, with the directions, with the space, an instructional guide to how to use the space.
And that's where it's, if we're playing with words again, it's not about them reading the work, it's that moment of encounter. And when you encounter work, like I kind of mentioned when I'm working with a project, I encounter a space or an image or something, and it's that moment of encounter and the feelings that I have in response to that thing that pose the question. That's where the question lies, is in the feeling of it. It's not in the quantitative the thought, the point, I know it's that colour, that shade, that thing, whatever it might be, it's not about that. But then that kind of pulls us into this territory when you're talking about when you're making the work and it's not for yourself, but it's a method of understanding. Or to be honest, in some ways, it's actually a method of coping. You know, it's a method of actually, well no, I'm coming back to me, it's a method of coping because it's consistent. I don't get what's going on here. And I'm in London where I'm based, I'm consistently surrounded by these developments, you know, these produced sites, fabricated sites, and I just, it's not that I don't get it, I just...
You don't have a choice about seeing it.
And it's, there's something going on with it, and it's not something I can kind of sum up in a couple of words, but for some reason I consistently feel like I need to try and not understand, but sort of shed a different light on that in whatever way it might be.
Would it be fair to say then that both of you are making kind of ongoing commentaries on your daily kind of experience and the objects and images that you encounter? Is it fair to say that it's commentary rather than kind of looking for an explorative space and invention?
I think with me, I would never say that my work is exclusively about where I work. It's not, you know, I work somewhere different now. I work in a completely different environment, I'm an art assistant. So I'm not making work about that now. But it's the fact that so to say it's a running commentary of my life, I think was a bit too kind of like, a bit...
I didn't say life, I just meant the objects and images that you encounter, because that seems to be the crossover between the two of you, is that the things that you can't kind of avoid because you're in London and you're seeing these things all the time, you're working, you're seeing these things. I was just wondering about like those, as in the same way that it's the viewer's choice to, you know, we have our own reading, it's also your kind of choice to make work about those specific things. So I was just wondering about the difference between making work that exists kind of in an explorative kind of space where it's more about invention, or I don't know, I was just thinking about those, because maybe you think about the kind of perhaps just the difference of the distinction between making work that is kind of about stuff that you really are, you know, you can't get away from day to day, or whether you go outside and you find the space where you're away from those things that you know.
Yeah, I think I don't know if we have slightly different approach to that, because I can't, I mean, we're both in London, so I can't get away from something, but I can't get, like, I felt it's kind of regeneration projects, which is more in your work. But I mean, I felt at the time that I couldn't get away from the situations that I was in. It was kind of necessary for me to work full time and to have a balance from trying to work full time and get enough money to pay the rent of my studio and have an art practice and spending time at work. So
I mean, I've tried also, as we've been talking now, I mean, what you're saying is an it's the work that I make, and I think also for Rebecca, as I was mentioning outside of artists, it's not about me saying to you, in the work, this is where I stand with it. I've tried to not weigh my work with saying this is a positive or a negative thing. I try to not build my attitude into the work. I just give it how it is, how I see that thing to be under the condition that I presented it as. When we're talking to how we respond to the situation that we are present in, I'm just going to sort of play this, I guess, as talking it, but this is a video piece I made for a show out in Sweden a few months ago, and all the content, everything you see in this video is sampled. I had no direct experience of any place or any image that is present in the video. Now, as we kind of go back to that idea of how you can, or how I sometimes act as someone who gathers content, signs, symbols and such things, and then reforms them under a different condition, under a different guise. Now this is called No Place Like Home, and it starts off with an Aboriginal story called the Rainbow Serpent, which is what they used as a folklore to talk about how dreaming is a way of bringing places into being. The way that they dreamed the world, they said, is what made the world the way it was. So I've gone through quite a few things with this, but this is another scene which is a hotel, which you can go and visit the online page of, and you can have a nice 360-degree pan of that hotel down in Mexico. And you can experience the place indirectly through that. Now, I have not been to this hotel. I'm experiencing that place, or the idea of that place, as, in some way, a leisure destination concept. And I've built this into the video. The particular scene you can kind of see here, I did some narration over the top of it. I don't really want to play it, but it was it's not the kind of right thing for now, but it was talking about, you know, mine is a generation, I guess, in such a way that seems to travel the world searching for something that we haven't tried before. You know, that's kind of what it seems to be about. It's this new experience, this kind of newfound thing. Again, this idea of progress, you know, or your friend's got a picture of themselves in front of the Eiffel Tower, whoever does it, and I want to be there. Why does everyone want to take the same picture in front of the Eiffel Tower? You know, why is that? I mean, honestly, in a very bigger picture way, that is a general consensus. They want that picture. You know, there's some sort of shared presence or ownership, familiarity in a site that gives or breeds comfort. And I think the question that comes out of that is, you know, how is that approach built, or how is that approach conditioned? Why do we feel like that? And how, for me anyway, do we access these sites as images in such a way which is now becoming the predominant thing?
So I think your work is kind of more about exoticism of these places as kind of a view from outside, where it's kind of unattainable kind of vision of these things that are kind of like perfectionized and out there in the world that you can't quite get to. So they're like GPS before, you know, having things in the GPS kind of coordinate that are out there somewhere, but we really can't quite physically get them. It is kind of we can't physically get there, but with me, I suppose it's more about spaces that I have lived in and experienced for long periods of time. So I think we have similar interests in certain ways, but we're both very bothered by the romanticism of these places. I think it's kind of
Can I just ask a quick question? You both seem to be dealing with some sort of idea of artifice and what's real. And I just wanted to know whether you thought that white cube space or art is a place to question what's real and maybe, yeah.
So the white cube space of
and art,
the gallery,
yeah.
art.
Whether you think that that's the place to question that.
I think taking things out of the kind of discourse of where they're expected to be makes you reevaluate these things on a kind of different level. So I think for me, I don't know. I mean, at one point I did actually consider like making a retail space and actually entirely designing it and having it in kind of like a more kind of fluid on a street in an old retail space and having all these things kind of as sort of proxy kind of things there. And that's still kind of an option for me, but I think I quite like the. Actually, for me, I think the lines are blurred because I feel like, you know, if people walk into an empty retail unit on a street and they encounter my work, then they're going to have like a different relationship, obviously, to when it's in a white cube space. And both of those are different, but I don't think that they're. I don't know if I'd necessarily prefer one or the other. I haven't had both yet. My work at the moment has been in white cube exhibition spaces. So, and I mean, when you go into an exhibition space, you expect to see art. It's kind of a real thing you do, like seeing artwork. So you almost go in there expecting there to be a message, even if which is. You go into these spaces thinking like, what is this person trying to say to me? Even if you, I don't necessarily like that idea that that's kind of a good thing for artists to of a good relationship between the viewer and the artist. But I think it's almost inevitable in that way.
I think it's actually a really interesting question in the way that it ties into, you know, I find that the white cube gallery space can be useful. I mean, if you think about the space you put the work in, think about that as a tool. Now, if you bring people into the white cube gallery space and you have a precondition in their approach, you know, you can put a Kronenbourg bottle on a pedestal, and all of a sudden it's got the context of it, the reading of it is shaped and changed. Now you take a performance piece and enact it directly, say in a shopping centre or a playground somewhere. Now the context will completely shift how that work is read, its placed, its position. Well, exactly. So these, for me, it's thinking about that situation for the work as a tool, and understanding the context and how that affects the reading of the work, and that's kind of how I look at it. When you bring people into that, I mean, when Mikey did that show with Dean, the whole of that, well, whitish kind of cute gallery space, was completely reformed, reshaped, and given a new condition. It was a world that we presented in them. I do think I think the one thing about the gallery space was kind of is it's a shame that sometimes it seems to be on a pedestal and is inaccessible to people in some ways, and it would be, it depends on the work, it would be great to give it a very open kind of platform, like public works of art, as I put, so anyone can experience them or just encounter on them or just kind of walk by and sort of, get some sort of shaped reading of them, but, we don't always have those kind of opportunities, but it's an interesting thing in the way that it can shape the reading of the world.
Or maybe you could set the retail space in some standard retail location and sell Oliver's work from it.
I did actually think at one point of creating kind of retail apparatus which would work alongside other artists' artwork and be a kind of like presentation point, like a stage for their work. I don't know why. Well, there's multiple reasons why I kind of stopped on that train. I think in the same way that when I actually thought about, I thought at one point I'd truly make a retail space. I thought we would actually open an art shop at one point because that's where it's working. But the materials got in the way. The kind of functionality of having to accommodate the materials got in the way. And in the same respect, I feel like I kind of felt like firstly I actually when I was thinking about doing it, when I was speaking to other people that potentially thought would be interested in this, I think I was worried that the reaction to like their art, how that would kind of be situated on these stands and how it would kind of detract from both. Whether there's some kind of a measure between those two things, I don't know. I haven't quite got to that point yet, but.
Well, I mean, if you're collaborating, then it makes it an interesting collaborative.
Yeah.
It might just be too heavy-handed.
This is the thing. It depends how much it sways each person's work. Whether I'd be making a stand for their work, or whether they'd be making artwork for my stand, or whether there'd be some kind of very collaborative, mutual meeting point. And I think potentially that could work. I think it's an idea that's actually still in the back of my mind at the moment. I find it easy to kind of make these works for myself, but it's still something there,
I think we're going to open it up to questions if anyone has any questions.
Any questions? Well, what's the
10 plus. Yeah.
Oh,
Is anyone's feedback about anything particular, like, even just something like that, whatever it might be, just interesting to kind of gauge that if anyone has any.
It just seemed to me when I asked about artifice, it seemed like when you position it in a quite cube space, there's another level of artifice on top of what you're sort of questioning. So it seems like, it's just sort of that sort of blurring maybe of like, how we experience reality now, and like constructed reality. Well, this is another constructed reality. So that just seemed like, maybe it was just another level of artifice, another level of what you would ask, the question that you brought up in the first place.
The gallery space and the gallery
What is really
institutions and artists.
I mean, it is a really interesting question, and it's one that also it's like a whole other kind of talking of it, because you think about the pedestal and the kind of metal that you put a work or a project on that pedestal, it acts in a different way. People have played with that in very interesting ways, but I think you do pose a question to us as practitioners, but also anyone as a practitioner, is how do you use the gallery space if you work with it?
yeah,
and how are you
navigate
aware
that
of
as
using
well?
it? How do you navigate that?
Yeah.
And I think people need to, you need to be aware of it as much as possible. And again, it's neither a good nor bad thing, but it does play a role.
Okay, can I just ask if you ever managed to go out and see how the furniture and stuff that was sort of being made in the first show we were talking about was actually being used by people?
No, I never did. The furthest I got to actually seeing any kind of physical manifestation of these things is when the only way they decide how big to make these things and how kind of like spatially they kind of be laid out was I had to make them out of foam board. So I had to kind of cut them out and kind of haphazardly with masking tape kind of make a basic shell of these things. So they could be like, yeah, that's fine. This is the distance. So, you know, I would almost kind of shut down the window and it's just kind of chance. Yeah, so no, I never actually got to experience how these things, and in the higher, I mean, they stay kind of slightly romanticized for me. They kind of stay as digital renders, they stay as ideas and flawed ideas. I mean, they would have been. I think it would have been equally, yeah, maybe I'm presuming too much when I say that, you know, they wouldn't have worked in reality, but I think it was more the kind of, maybe people would react to them would interact with them in the way they were meant to, but then it's kind of more of a broad conversation about, how, as the gentleman was saying earlier, how people were taught to react to these, how they were conditioned after years of working on the space to condition working with these things.
It's a question for everyone as well, so we all have our preconditions. Is there any other questions?
Thanks, Cameron.